David Whitmore, Chief International Analyst, Global Insight News, June 17th, 2026. A document was signed, not during a grand ceremony, not in front of rows of national flags, and not under the glare of television cameras. Instead, it was signed electronically. One signature came from Donald Trump, who was in France. The other came from Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian in Tehran. What they signed was not a peace treaty, not a formal alliance, not even a traditional nuclear agreement. It was a memorandum of understanding, and it may prove to be one of the most consequential diplomatic documents of the early 21st century. Tonight, we're going beyond the headlines, beyond the political slogans, beyond the social media reactions. We're going to examine what is actually written inside this agreement, what Iran agreed to, what the United States agreed to, what remains unresolved, and perhaps most importantly, what this agreement tells us about the state of global power in 2026. To understand the significance of this deal, we first need to understand how we got here, because this agreement did not emerge overnight. Its roots stretch back more than a year. In April 2025, Donald Trump reportedly sent a personal letter to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. That alone was unusual. Direct communication between American and Iranian leadership has always been politically sensitive. But the letter opened a door, a small one at first, then a larger one, and eventually a channel for negotiations. The first high-level meeting took place in Muscat, Oman. Across the table sat Steve Witkoff, representing Washington. Facing him was Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Official statements described the discussions as constructive. But nobody involved believed trust had suddenly appeared. Trust was never the foundation of these talks. Necessity was. For more than 4 decades, relations between Washington and Tehran have been defined by suspicion, by sanctions, by proxy conflicts, by competing visions of regional power. And yet by 2025, both sides were facing growing pressure. Iran's economy was struggling under the weight of years of sanctions. Inflation remained high. The national currency had lost significant value. Many Iranian households were facing increasing financial hardship. Meanwhile, the United States was showing signs of strategic fatigue. Successive administrations had spent years managing crises across the Middle East. And Donald Trump wanted something different. He wanted a deal that could be presented as a diplomatic breakthrough, a deal that previous administrations had failed to achieve. Negotiations continued, not once, not twice, but through multiple rounds spread across months. Meetings were held in Oman, then in Rome, then again in Muscat. Behind the scenes, Pakistan also played a role, a discrete role, but by several accounts, an important one. Its leadership helped maintain communication between parties when discussions became difficult, and there were many difficult moments. Finally, on June 14th, 2026, both sides announced they had reached an agreement in principle. 3 days later, the document was signed. But here's something many observers misunderstand. This is not simply a new version of the 2015 nuclear deal. It is not JCPOA 2.0. This agreement is far broader. It combines military commitments, economic commitments, nuclear commitments, maritime commitments, and regional security commitments, all within a single framework. That breadth is both en saktan renich prickender, beartak spar pertreiber, wicked and earn cards, weakness, because each section contains different interests, different timelines, different political risks, different opportunities for failure. Before examining the 5 major pillars of the agreement, we need to consider the geography involved, because geography drives strategy, and strategy drives diplomacy. Iran occupies one of the most strategically significant positions in the world. Its influence extends far beyond its borders. The Strait of Hormuz, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. Each of these locations plays a role in the broader balance of power across the Middle East. Any agreement involving Tehran inevitably affects all of them, and that is why every sentence in this document is being interpreted differently in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Riyadh, in Moscow, and in Beijing. Now let's examine the first major pillar of the agreement, the cessation of hostilities, the military component. This section is remarkably ambitious. The language leaves very little room for interpretation. Both sides commit to an immediate and permanent end to hostilities. Immediate, permanent. Those are powerful words. Not a temporary ceasefire, not a humanitarian pause, not a suspension of operations, a permanent end, at least on paper. And that distinction matters because reality began challenging the agreement almost immediately. Just hours after the announcement of the framework deal, military activity continued elsewhere in the region. Events on the ground reminded everyone that diplomacy and reality do not always move at the same speed. And this reveals one of the fundamental limitations of the agreement. It binds Washington, it binds Tehran, but it does not automatically bind every actor operating within the region. That difference could become critically important in the months ahead. The second military issue involves one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of global oil shipments pass through this narrow corridor. When Hormuz is stable, energy markets breathe easier. When Hormuz is threatened, the entire world pays attention. According to the agreement, maritime restrictions would be eased and commercial traffic would resume normal operations. For energy markets, this represents a major development. For global shipping companies, it represents stability. For Iran, it represents economic opportunity. But even here, disagreements emerged. Questions regarding sovereignty, questions regarding maritime authority, questions regarding future fees and responsibilities. In diplomacy, details matter, sometimes more than headlines, and the details surrounding Hormuz remain far from settled. Now we arrive at what may be the most immediately tangible section of the agreement, the economy. For ordinary Iranian citizens, this is likely the part that matters most, because economic realities affect daily life. Food prices, employment, savings, investment, opportunity. The language in the economic section is striking. The United States commits to ending multiple categories of sanctions imposed on Iran. That is an extraordinary promise. Years of economic pressure, years of restrictions, years of financial isolation, potentially being rolled back. But there is a critical detail. The timeline remains incomplete. The commitment exists. The implementation process still needs to be negotiated. And in international diplomacy, implementation is often more difficult than agreement. One area where movement appears more immediate involves frozen Iranian assets held abroad. Under the framework, significant financial resources could become available to Tehran once implementation begins. For an economy that has struggled under sanctions, that capital could provide substantial relief. Businesses would gain access to liquidity. Financial institutions would gain flexibility. The government would gain room to maneuver. But perhaps the most remarkable figure appears later in the document. $300 billion. That's the scale of the proposed reconstruction and economic development initiative discussed by negotiators. $300 billion. $300 billion. That number alone explains why global markets are watching these negotiations so closely. If such a program were fully implemented, it could transform Iran's economic landscape, infrastructure, energy, industry, technology, trade. Virtually every sector could be affected, and the implications would extend far beyond Iran. A reintegrated Iranian economy would alter trade routes, investment flows, energy markets, and regional influence. This is not merely about sanctions relief. It is about reintegration into the global economy. That is a much larger objective. The oil sector provides another example. Under the proposed framework, Iranian oil exports could return to international markets on a much larger scale. That means more supply, more competition, and potentially lower pressure on global energy prices. For Tehran, oil revenue represents economic oxygen. For consumers worldwide, increased supply could provide welcome stability. Again, however, success depends on implementation. Promises are important. Execution is everything. And that brings us to a critical analytical question. What exactly is Washington receiving in return? The United States appears willing to ease sanctions, unlock financial assets, support economic reintegration, and potentially participate in an enormous reconstruction effort. Why? What is the strategic exchange? The answer lies in the next phase of the agreement, the nuclear provisions. And the broader question of regional stability, those sections contain the concessions Washington considers most valuable. Whether those concessions ultimately justify the economic commitments is a debate that has only just begun. And that's where we'll continue our analysis in the next segment. David Whitmore, Chief International Analyst, Global Insight News. So, if the economic section explains what Iran receives, the next question becomes obvious. What does the United States receive in return? The answer begins with the nuclear file. And this is where the agreement becomes considerably more complicated. For decades, Iran's nuclear program has been at the center of international tensions. It has shaped sanctions, military planning, regional alliances, and diplomatic negotiations. Virtually every major discussion between Washington and Tehran eventually circles back to one issue: the possibility of a nuclear weapon. The new agreement attempts to address that concern, but not in the way many expected. According to the text, Iran agrees to maintain the current status of its nuclear program until a final agreement is negotiated. Notice the wording carefully: maintain, not dismantle, not reduce, not reverse, maintain. That distinction is crucial because freezing a program is not the same thing as rolling it back. The program remains where it is today. The infrastructure remains, the expertise remains, the technical knowledge remains. What changes is the pace of future development, at least temporarily. For supporters of the agreement, this creates breathing room. It reduces immediate escalation risks. It allows diplomacy to continue, and it prevents further advances while negotiations proceed. For critics, however, the arrangement raises difficult questions, because a frozen program can still be a highly advanced program. And that debate is already becoming one of the most contentious aspects of the entire agreement. Another sensitive issue involves enriched uranium stockpiles. The agreement outlines a framework under which existing material would be managed under international supervision. The precise mechanism remains subject to further negotiations, but the principle is clear: transparency, verification, oversight. These are the pillars negotiators hope will build confidence, and confidence is exactly what has been missing for years. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is expected to play a central role. Inspections would resume, monitoring systems would be strengthened, verification procedures would be expanded. These are significant developments because no agreement can survive without a credible mechanism for determining whether commitments are actually being honored. Yet even here, unresolved issues remain, particularly regarding highly sensitive facilities, underground complexes, restricted military zones, sites that have long generated controversy among international observers. These locations remain among the most politically sensitive elements of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and their status could ultimately determine whether the final agreement succeeds or fails. This is why many analysts view the nuclear section as incomplete rather than settled. It creates a framework, but not yet a final solution. It opens a path, but it does not guarantee the destination. And in international diplomacy, those are very different things. Now, let's turn to the fourth pillar of the agreement: regional stability. arguably the most politically complex section of the entire document. Because unlike economics or nuclear technology, regional conflicts involve multiple actors, multiple governments, multiple armed groups, and multiple competing interests. The agreement calls for an end to hostilities across the region. A broad objective, a highly ambitious objective, and one that immediately raises practical questions. How do you reduce tensions across multiple theaters simultaneously? How do you transform decades of confrontation into cooperation? How do you align actors who often have fundamentally different objectives? Those questions remain unanswered. Take Lebanon as an example. For years, Lebanon has existed at the intersection of regional rivalries, Iranian influence, Israeli security concerns, international diplomatic efforts, domestic political challenges, all overlapping in a remarkably complex environment. The agreement recognizes that reality. But recognizing complexity is easier than solving it. The same challenge exists elsewhere, in Iraq, in Yemen, across various regional networks and organizations that have shaped Middle Eastern politics for decades. One notable feature of the agreement is what it does not say. It does not require the immediate dismantling of regional alliances. It does not explicitly demand the termination of every existing relationship. Instead, the language remains relatively restrained, flexible, carefully constructed, and perhaps intentionally ambiguous. For Tehran, that represents an important achievement. Iran has consistently argued that its regional relationships are separate from its nuclear negotiations. And in many respects, this agreement reflects that position. For Washington, the calculation appears different. American negotiators seem to have prioritized de-escalation over confrontation, stability over maximal demands. Whether that strategy proves successful remains uncertain. This brings us to the fifth and final pillar, verification, perhaps the least dramatic section, but arguably the most important. Because every promise contained in this document ultimately depends on one thing: trust. And trust alone is never enough. Verification exists because trust has limits. The agreement proposes the creation of oversight mechanisms designed to monitor implementation, compliance, reporting, review procedures, accountability structures, all intended to ensure that commitments become actions, not merely words. Perhaps even more significant is the proposal for international endorsement through the United Nations system. If achieved, such a step would elevate the agreement beyond a bilateral understanding. It would become part of a broader international framework, one supported by multiple global powers, at least in theory. But theory and reality do not always align, because obtaining international consensus is rarely simple. Major powers have different interests, different priorities, different strategic calculations. What appears logical from one capital may appear unacceptable from another, and that reality introduces uncertainty into the next phase of negotiations. Behind every line of this agreement lies a larger geopolitical story, a story extending far beyond Washington and Tehran, a story involving Moscow, Beijing, European capitals, regional powers, energy markets, security alliances, and global competition. The world today is experiencing a profound geopolitical transition. Traditional assumptions are being challenged. Old alliances are evolving, new partnerships are emerging, economic relationships are shifting, and this agreement exists within that broader transformation. It is not an isolated event. It is part of a much larger strategic picture. So after examining all five pillars, the military provisions, the economic provisions, the nuclear framework, regional stability, and verification mechanisms, we arrive at the central question: who actually benefits, who gains, who loses, and who simply buys time? The answer is more nuanced than either side would publicly admit. Iran appears to secure significant economic advantages: potential sanctions relief, access to financial assets, expanded energy exports. and the possibility of broader integration into global markets. Those are substantial gains, very substantial gains. The United States, meanwhile, secures something different, a diplomatic achievement, reduced immediate tensions, a framework for future negotiations, and the possibility of avoiding another major regional escalation. Politically, those outcomes carry considerable value, especially for an administration eager to demonstrate results. But neither side obtains everything it wants, and that may be the clearest indication that genuine negotiation took place. Perfect victories are rare in diplomacy. Most agreements survive because all parties compromise, and compromise inevitably creates critics. There are also actors beyond the negotiating table, countries watching closely, governments evaluating consequences, allies assessing risks, competitors reassessing strategies. For them, this agreement raises new questions about regional influence and future power dynamics, questions that will not be answered immediately, and perhaps that is the most important conclusion of all. This document does not end the story. It begins a new chapter, a chapter filled with opportunity, but also uncertainty, a chapter that could reshape regional politics or collapse under the weight of unresolved disputes. Both outcomes remain possible because ultimately, agreements do not succeed when they are signed. They succeed when they are implemented day after day, month after month, year after year. That is the true test. And that test has only just begun. The document exists, the signatures are in place, the commitments have been announced. But diplomacy is measured by outcomes, not ceremonies, by results, not headlines, and by implementation, not promises. Over the coming weeks, negotiators will attempt to transform this framework into a permanent agreement. The world will be watching, investors will be watching, governments will be watching, and perhaps most importantly, millions of ordinary people whose lives are affected by these decisions will be watching as well. Whether this Memorandum of Understanding becomes a historic turning point or another unrealized diplomatic ambition remains an open question. One that only time can answer. I'm David Whitmore, Chief International Analyst for Global Insight News. Thank you for joining us, and we'll continue to follow every major development in this story. Until next time.